Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Daniel McAdams. And Daniel's been with me before, but let me just say that the way I look at Daniel is that when you listen to what he has to say, you're listening to pretty much what Ron Paul hears from this man, because Daniel's been picked by Ron to head up the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity for a good reason. Daniel provided a lot of intelligence and groundwork, a lot of information for Ron Paul when Ron Paul was a congressman. And so obviously Ron Paul has a great deal of trust in Daniel, and it's really, really good to have him with us today. Daniel has been as I say, he's been with us before. He has served as the Foreign Affairs, Civil Liberties, and Defense Policy Advisor to Congressman Paul from during 1993 to 1999, I believe. And he worked as a journalist based in Budapest, Hungary, and traveled through the former communist bloc as a human rights monitor and election observer. Really good to have you, Daniel. Thanks for joining me again.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be with you. Actually, I was with Dr. Paul from 2001 until his retirement in early 2013.
Wonderful. So you had a good long time with Dr. Paul.
Very long
it was
time.
1993 to 1999 that you were that you worked as a journalist in Budapest, and involved very much in human rights monitoring. Very interesting. So you've had a lot of experience in monitoring human rights. So how does what's going on now in the United States compare with some of the things you saw in some of those places that we always look down our noses at as being horrible when it comes to human rights? How much better are we doing these days than some of those Eastern Bloc countries did after the fall of the Soviets?
Well, actually, what I found when I was over there in the 90s is that most often the countries where the U.S. Was very friendly toward the rulers, they had the most abominable conditions. You know, I was in Georgia in 1998, where our good buddy Shevardnadze was running things, and I toured some of the political prisons there, and really it was something out of Dante's Inferno. It was just horrific. So, unfortunately, the neoconservatives who dominate our foreign policy and who meddle overseas, they usually pick the most grotesque and totalitarian type of person to support overseas, and that's the one thing I took away from those several years operating overseas more than anything.
Do you think perhaps they feel the protection of the United States government, so therefore they feel free to do more and to take more? If they didn't have that protection, than they would if they didn't have that protection sometimes?
Yeah, and I think what you also saw, particularly in the immediate post-communist period, you had a lot of people who had maintained power for a long time doing what they were told from Moscow. These people were able to maintain their power by simply switching their allegiances. The great communists became the great so-called capitalists.
Yeah.
The party bosses now owned the factories. They were more than happy to do the bidding of Washington on certain things, provided that they were able to keep the loot that they stole in the first place.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. What does Dr. Paul hope to achieve with this institute?
Well, we have a very different mission from your standard Washington think tank. I was at an event last week with all of the sort of usual Washington think tank, foreign policy think tank types. It was a good event, but I realized as I was sitting there that basically this is a group of very, very well-connected elites only talking to each other in a language that only they understand. And that's something that, as you know, Dr. Paul never wanted to do his career. His goal is to help educate and to connect with people who are interested in these issues but are not in this sort of inside the beltway mentality. So our mission is to speak to people who are informed and interested in foreign policy in a way that they can understand and appreciate, not talking down to them, but giving them a different and fresh perspective. So we have a very, very different mission when it comes to that.
How often do you have the honor of meeting up with Dr. Paul or talking to him? I just know that I've had a few occasions in my life to do so, and he is just one of the kindest, gentlest, decent human beings that I've ever come in contact with from what I've seen in the brief periods of time I've had with him. So I envy you in a way, Daniel, because I know you have contact with Dr. Paul frequently. How often do you get to speak with him?
Well, he's very much involved. I mean, he's the founder, he's the CEO and chairman of his institute. So this is his baby, and we're in constant communication. I'm down in Texas quite often. We're on the phone, probably every other day. He provides a lot of guidance. But it's also true that I've worked very closely with him for 12 years, and in the capacity, especially in Congress, you learn to sort of think, like your boss. And I feel like I've been able to internalize, not that I, needed to change my positions, but I've internalized how he would view things. And that's the benefit of having spent so much time with Dr. Paul, and I've benefited enormously because he's a fantastic teacher.
Yeah. Well, I used to publish in my own newsletter every week. I used to publish his weekly, I think it was Texas Straight Talk or something like that. And I used to publish it every week. And I remember telling him one time that sometimes I just plunk it in my newsletter, don't read it, because I've never found anything I disagreed with. And that sounds dangerous. You should, and I'm sure there are a few things here and there that I might not quite agree with Dr. Paul on, but somehow I think the basic philosophy of Dr. Paul is what I was brought up with in the 1950s in Ohio. What I was brought up with Charles Smith, my eighth grade teacher, who required us to learn the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence, which I think most kids wouldn't even know exists anymore. But the philosophy of government and because it gets back to your basic philosophy of what life is all about, and that whole introduction to the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence puts the emphasis on the individual as being most important, right? And the state is there to serve the individual. Whereas, is this the philosophy of Ron Paul, and what does he hope? And is that what's really sort of built into the purpose of the Institute?
Sure, and I think even deeper to a degree than that is the philosophy of Dr. Paul is a simple philosophy of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we like that on a personal level, but on a level as a nation as well and internationally. So I think those are two very strong guiding principles in Dr. Paul's philosophy.
Yeah, I can remember, and I'm just sort of chuckling, and I shouldn't be laughing because it's sad in a way. But I can remember when he used that term, the golden rule, when he was in a debate, and he was almost hissed at for it. And the other thing that he said is that the reason they're over here on 9/11, the reason they came over here is because we're over there. And of course, that really, really got people ticked off.
But the funny thing is, it was so logical, and as Dr. Paul has explained subsequently, basically you had a crime, you had a murder that was committed on 9/11. In any murder investigation, one of the first things you look for is you want to look for the motive. Why why were these people motivated to commit these crimes? And so, and by investigating the motive, you're by no means condoning the crime. On the contrary, you're looking to be able to get a conviction, whether it's in the court of opinion or the court of law, what have you. And so what Dr. Paul was saying is, let's listen to the people who committed this crime, and let's hear why they said it, why they did it. There's plenty of evidence from Osama bin Laden why he was irritated. That doesn't justify what he did, but it certainly is worth looking at why he was irritated. One of the things he did not like was U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting, Jay, is a couple of years later, when enough of the smoke literally and figuratively had cleared after 9/11, the U.S. quietly closed all of its military bases in Saudi Arabia. So obviously they were paying attention to the enormous danger that this was causing. So in a sense, that movement of our troops was a justification for what Dr. Paul said in the first place.
Yeah, interesting. And yet it's never been really explained that way, has it been? It's
no. They were relocated for better positions or something like that.
Very interesting. Well, of course, Saudi Arabia also is where Mecca is, right? It's a very religious country. It's to the Muslims to have Americans and Westerners coming in and imposing their values or lack of values, I think in many cases, imposing our will on them must just rub these people the wrong way to a great extent.
And also, it's so blatantly obvious that the U.S. support there is not for the people of Saudi Arabia, it's for the dictators that rule the country. So there's that added irritation on the part of the population that these U.S. bases are here to keep us down. For all this talk of democracy, the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia was to prevent any kind of democracy from rising up. That's the last thing we wanted. And the same is true in places, in places like Yemen and elsewhere. Certainly Qatar and Bahrain. The U.S. presence there is to keep democracy from happening.
It's really incredible, and yet that's what we're supposed to be. Our boys and girls are supposed to be giving their lives for, right? I don't know that we don't hear that propaganda so much anymore, but I think people still have that notion that that's why we go to is for the ideal, the lofty ideals of our republic. Well, it's not a republic, our democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Jay, I think there's a danger though that I think you touched on it a second ago. We are becoming so much more cynical that these lofty slogans no longer have any power. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we're in the era of the drone. Our men and women no longer over there fighting. They're sitting in a warehouse somewhere in New Mexico pushing buttons.
To kill people.
16 civilians were killed yesterday in U.S. drone attacks.
Wow, 16.
Yes.
Did you? Now, I should mention to our listeners the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, the website, I believe, is ronpaulinstitute.org, right?
That's correct, yes.
And did you have a report of that on your website yesterday, or you will have? Or
we're working on that now. We've written a lot about drones, and the rise of drone warfare and the era of the drone and what it's done to the image of the U.S. overseas. If you look, the Pew organization does a poll on people's opinions toward the U.S. every year. They do this, and if you look at the consistent decline from 2001 to 2013, it's just astonishing to see. Even in places that are supposedly our close allies, like Jordan, where Secretary Kerry was, I think, last week. I think the latest poll said that something like 12% of the population has a positive view of the U.S. So this is one of the so-called friendly countries.
Well, so the world is really hating us more and more now, and wasn't that one of the things that President Obama was going to turn around? At least we heard that from the liberals.
That's what we did here, and he turned around the way we interact overseas, I think, but I don't think it's for the better. Mm-hmm. Pulling out the troops in these places has been good to a degree for the troops, for the poor folks that have finally come home. Mm-hmm. But the way he's conducting warfare is, I think, in an even more cynical way, and a more dangerous way.
Just kill them. Just kill them. Kill anybody that might possibly get in your way one day. And you have to wonder, why that wouldn't apply to us here and those of us who speak out against the government. Why wouldn't we all be potentially in danger?
Well, a lot of people are looking at poor old Michael Hastings' car crash a few weeks ago. The conspiracy theorists are having a field day with that one. Who knows?
I don't know about that story. Tell us about it.
Well, he's the Rolling Stone reporter, the one who basically broke the General McChrystal case. McChrystal had to step down or was fired based on the reporting that Hastings did a couple of years back. Mm-hmm. And as the story goes, apparently he was working on a very, very hot expose on the CIA, I think based in part on some of these NSA leaks, mm-hmm. The night that he had this very interesting car crash in L.A. and fiery crash, and he was killed. And so it's hard to sort out. I mean, the folks who take conspiracy too far have all sorts of wild theories, but it is very chilling. He apparently contacted an attorney the night he was killed, saying, I feel like the FBI is investigating me, and I need to lie low for a while.
Wow.
So it's who knows.
Well, there's so much in the way of conspiracy theories and so forth. Senator Paul Wellstone, for example, I've just recently come across some things. But I don't want to get too much into that today, Daniel. But I just want people to go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Ron writes articles up there all the time. Yes. He's got one up there now, the Defense Bill Debate: a House Divided Over NSA Spying on Americans, and I guess he's referring there to the legislation that narrowly was defeated the other day. That Congressman Amash, his name is Congressman, that really got behind it. And I guess we could be discouraged because it was defeated. But on the other hand, I think it's making some people wake up to the fact that there's a lot of Americans out there that are getting kind of ticked off about being spied on, having everything that we do watched and recorded and taken from us.
Yes, exactly. And, Congressman Paul is always an optimist, and he always tries to look for the positive side. And, this was an amendment to a defense appropriation bill. And it was Representative Amash from Michigan offered this amendment, which have simply struck funding for these NSA programs that are targeting Americans who are not otherwise under a warranted investigation. So it would have cut the money for the spying on all of our calls. And it was a very narrow defeat, and that was encouraging to a degree. But what was even more interesting, as Congressman Paul wrote in his piece, was that the division was not along party lines. You basically see, you're seeing people lined up, those who feel, who take their oaths seriously, and those who want to continue defending what's become a police state. And, there was an article that came out a couple of days later, a very interesting analysis of voting behavior on that particular amendment. And it turns out those who voted to keep these NSA programs, on average, were receiving 122% more money from defense contractors than those who voted to curb the NSA spying.
Wow.
So that says a lot about lobbyists and money and the role that this plays in the so-called keeping us safe.
Well, I would go back to to why money is so easy, and so go back to 1971 August, and when Mr. Nixon made the printing press available to the special interest, in essence. But that's a little bit getting off the track. There's so much, Daniel. I can see we're only going to scratch the surface here today with the many things you have on your website and things you have to talk about. And of course, you refresh this website every day, don't you? You have something new.
Well, we have new things every day, and we have categories. We have a little feature we call Neocon Watch. It's something that they've never, I don't think, had before. We're keeping an eye on them, and we're reporting to our readers the kinds of crazy things they're doing and saying, the kinds of insidious things they're doing and saying, and it's kind of shining the light back on them. So we have a lot of fun with that, but hopefully it's informative because people need to know these things. We have a Congress Alert section where we get behind the legislation. Myself and a couple of colleagues that work with me on it, we've had years of analyzing between the lines. And these bills and these amendments are not the way they're presented.
Right.
So hopefully we're able to give some value added to the average reader who wants to know what is really going on behind this stuff. What's the real story? We've got an Iran sanctions bill coming up this week, and that's actually a story I'm working on right now. And we're trying to break it down and let people know what it's really about and who's behind it. So that's hopefully the value we have, and we try to keep it, as I say, not think tanky language. We want to keep it journalistic language. We want to try to engage people and bring them into what we're doing. We have a very active Facebook page that you can link to from our homepage at ronpaulinstitute.org. And, of course, with Twitter as well. So we really want to reach out to people and inform them some things that they're not getting in the mainstream media, that's for sure.
Well, the Institute runs on donations, and I must say that I gave a very modest donation this week myself because I believe so much in what Ron Paul is doing here. And our listeners, if you're of that mind, should consider doing so as well. I guess you can just do that through the website, right, Daniel? They can go right on the website.
Well, thank you very much, Jay, for your vote of support. Really, I know Dr. Paul will be thrilled to hear that. He, as you know, he runs a very tight ship, and we do not waste a penny, I can assure you.
I know that's true. I learned many years ago that Dr. Paul used to give some money back. He would squeeze you guys that were working with him, and and he would give money back to the government and underspend his allocation at times. But that's because we so much appreciate the generous support, and I have to say, Jay, it's interesting. We get support from all over the world. The rest of the world also wants to support a non-interventionist foreign policy. So we have donors and people who are interested in what we're doing
I mean, you'd be surprised across the world, and we do depend on folks who are willing to support Congressman Paul's ideas. Peace and prosperity, the two of them are so linked. Jay, as we talked about offline, the total cost of these wars since 2001 is now over $1.5 trillion.
Wow.
So you talk about what that does to our economy to have that money just sucked out. Right. So the relationship between peace and prosperity is such an intimate relationship that people who are interested primarily in finance certainly are very interested in what we're doing as well.
Absolutely. And while Detroit and lots of other American cities are going down, now they're going down for reasons that are not totally related to war, but of course to an extent they are. The $1.5 trillion you're talking about, Daniel, for the Afghan and the Iraqi wars.
Yes.
So but beyond that, we're spending a huge amount.
All wars since 2001. So you put them all together in that, yeah.
And beyond that, of course, we have a military that's in how many countries?
Oh, it was 120 some countries. There's a military presence of some sort.
Yeah. So do we have any foreign countries with military presence in our country? I mean, other than perhaps spies, but do we have any?
Can you imagine the reaction here if the Iranians decided to build a base in Texas somewhere?
Well, let's say the Chinese decided to come in and set up a base in New Jersey. Huh? How would that work?
Yeah, it's just...
I mean, it's just absurd. It's just absurd.
Congressman Paul always tries to ask us to look at the rest of the world through their eyes, how they view our actions and how we feel if the shoe is on the other foot. So it's a useful thing to do.
Yeah, I might mention also one of the things, and I watched this earlier today from your site, Greenwald previews new blockbuster NSA story. It's really talking about and actually confirming a lot of the things that Mr. Snowden said about how he, as an outsider, was able to go in basically and wiretap even the President of the United States. And, I'm just thinking, Daniel, my engineer is telling me we're just about out of time. This has gone so fast, we're going to have you back. But I would just encourage people to go to this website. It's an extremely informative website, very entertaining website, sometimes not exactly what you want to see. I mean, I had a whole bunch of things to talk about the Neocon Watch, which I think is spectacular. And Daniel, you have basically an article I think you wrote on the Neocon Watch here concerning, I'm trying to think, what was it you just wrote about? You just wrote about one of these, I can't remember which. Anyway, it was a very interesting article that you just wrote that was on the Neocon Watch.
Oh, yeah, well, we did one on a recent one on Zalmay Khalilzad in Afghanistan. But we also, we did one on Anthony Cordesman a couple of days ago. And Lindsey Graham, that's what you're talking about. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge one. We had so many readers. It was, I guess everyone just loves to hate Lindsey Graham.
Well, he is a neocon. We've got some others too. We've got one in New Jersey, the somewhat overweight governor that is also very, very critical of peace and liberty. He wants to enslave all of us as well.
Yes, exactly.
Daniel, we're out of time. We'll have you back. I want to do this on a regular basis if you're willing. So
love to do it, Jay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being with us. We do have to go to our commercial break and our next guest, but we'll have you back.